Sure. And we are live here on Facebook. Hi, everyone. Thank you for watching. Our viewers are tuning in. We're here with a portion of our presidential trio. Hopefully, President Jamie Washington will be joining us shortly. I am Bethany Tognacci. I am the ACPA Director of Marketing, working out of the International Office in Washington, D.C., and I am here solely to monitor this Facebook Live event that we have going on and to serve as a moderator, and any sort of questions that you have throughout the event, I'll be able to send over to Stephen and Craig and Jamie once he joins us. So feel free to just use the comments box to post any sort of questions you have or statements or things that you want to know more about, and I can certainly send those over. So feel free to share this video. You should be able to share it on your personal pages, or if you're an entity group watching, you can share it to your entity page, any sort of department site you'd like to stream it on. This will be up and live on our page after the event is over as well, so you can certainly share with colleagues after the fact, but we just wanted to get together today and give some updates on the imperative and hear from our trio. So I will let them take over and introduce themselves, and we'll go from there. Stephen, you would like to start?
Hi, everyone. Sure. Thanks, Bethany. So I'm Stephen. I currently serve as past president of ACPA. Use he, him, his pronouns, and other than that, I also am a faculty member in student affairs in the higher education program at Miami University, and I'm excited to join you all today and hear what questions you have and to share some updates and things around this new strategic imperative. I guess it's not so new at this point, but the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. So just glad to be with you all for the next hour or so. So thank you.
And hi, everyone. I'm Craig Elliott, and I'm currently serving as the ACPA Vice President, and I also work at Samuel Merritt University in Oakland, California, and serve as the Assistant Vice President for Enrollment Student Services. And I, too, am just pleased to be here and be a part of this conversation.
So before we get to your questions, I think what might be helpful for some context is I just want to give a little bit of background on how we got to this place as an association, maybe where we are currently, and then where we hope to be going in the future. So those of you who have been intimately involved with the imperative, likely none of this is going to be new. But since I don't know who's tuning in, I think it's best to provide just a little bit of context for folks. And it might even be helpful for those who have been with us along the way as well. So in the fall of 2016, the current ACPA governing board, at the time then Donna Lee was president, I was serving as vice president, and Gavin Henning was the past president of the association. We held a retreat, and where we were just trying to connect with the board, figure out where we wanted to go as an association, get to know each other a little bit more, and from that process came up. We just kept hearing folks saying that there was a lot of pain and frustration and just a lot of hurt among communities of color on their campuses, and story after story from members of the board they kept sharing stories of just the hurt that was happening, the healing that was needed, and we felt out of that conversation that there was this strong desire for folks to coalesce around race and to center race and to try to make sense of it and to understand how we heal from racism and just the pain and violence that occurs in the midst of racism. And so out of that, we decided to center a lot of attention onto racial justice, racial healing, racial awareness, essentially just prioritizing that as an association for the near future. And so when we call it an imperative, what we mean by that is that at this present moment, we are deciding to devote focused attention to a core issue that we feel is really important for members and for people who are not even members to be involved in. And so out of that retreat, we decided to center racial justice. And so we ended up calling it the Strategic Imperative for Racial Justice. Shortly thereafter, we got feedback from some members of the Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous Network at the time, who shared with us that the term race and racial identity didn't capture the full range of their experiences with colonization and their political identities. And so out of hearing that feedback, we decided to expand it to include decolonization as a focus as well, which is where we landed with the Strategic Imperative for Racial Justice and Decolonization, to center on race as well as to racial justice, as well as trying to decolonize our practices that again make them better for people of color as well as native folks as well. And so that's where we are today with the imperative. So from my perspective, so serving as president last year and then president now, the ways that I think we as a board have tried to conceptualize the imperative is through, I think, three sort of primary steps. So step number one was just awareness. So really trying to understand, when we say racial justice, like, what do we mean by that? When we say decolonization, what do we mean by that? And so we spent some time at the 2017 July leadership meeting as a board and ACPA leaders, really trying to get some more awareness around these two terms. And we spent some time in small groups processing what racial justice means to us, processing this term colonization and decolonization. What does that mean when we choose to go after that as an association? And so step one, again, has really just been around awareness, like gathering lots of resources and trying to educate ourselves so that we understand what we mean by these two terms. And so that was really what step one was about. Step two then is the internalization phase. So once you've developed awareness about an issue, I think it's much harder to then internalize it. So we know that racism exists in our society. We know that colonization exists in our society. We know we have lots of isms that exist: sexism, genderism, like all of these isms. Like, we are aware of it as members, but I think it's much harder to then internalize and figure out, well, what does that mean for my day-to-day work? And so I think that's kind of where we're trying to shift now, is to, what does it mean when we internalize these terms? And so how does that shift the ways in which we engage, shift the ways in which we show up, et cetera? And then I think the last phase is then the concretization phase. So making this like concrete. So moving from awareness to internalization. And then when you concretize it, it shows up in how you act. So you move forward, it affects your practices, your policies, the ways in which you participate and engage with one another. And I should also say that this process is not, there's no end point. It's not that you get to this place where you're like the racial justice and decolonization warrior and you've sort of figured it all out, but it's also cyclical. So just as I am very aware of race, I am not as aware of decolonization. I am not as aware of sexism. So for me, it's a process of trying to educate myself in the areas that I'm not as aware of or that I'm not as comfortable in. And I think that shifts depending on how you show up and what your perspective is. So I think we're trying to then move again to that last phase where we are trying to build an array of resources for our members so that they can begin to do some of this work around racial justice and decolonization in their own work as well. And I want to just give a shout out to the ACPA 18 convention team, or what year are we in? The 17 convention team. No, it was 18. Sorry. So the 18 convention team, where Deanne Squire and Len Hune really developed some resources for us around this syllabus that I think helped us really develop some more awareness and some more internalization of some of the readings around racial justice and decolonization. So yeah, so that's, I think, an overview, some context, and then kind of, I think, the three-step process of how I think we as an association and a governing board got to where we are today. So with that, I'll stop there and just kind of open it up and see if Craig has any comments or what questions might come up from folks who are tuning in.
Yeah, I think that's, thank you, Stephen. I think just to add that a lot of this work has been setting a foundation for our consciousness and our knowledge as an association and higher education. And I think kind of the future of this would be really building around the social change process about as we develop awareness and consciousness about all of this, that we're going to be moving to knowledge and expanding knowledge so that we can develop skills, so that we can navigate the complexities of what it means to be racially just and decolonized. And then from the skills, then we can do some collective action. And so it's really about moving the association and higher education forward to be the kind of to be racially just, to be more just, and to be the kind of association that's in alignment with our values and the kind of service and work we want to do with our students.
We don't have any questions as of yet, but if anybody has anything that they'd like to gain clarification on, feel free to just add those in the comments.
I think while we're waiting for some comments to come in, I think there's an opportunity for us to talk about the upcoming Institute for Aspiring SSAOs, and then it has a theme of exploring underrepresented identities, and really we're trying to link our professional development work into the strategic imperative as well, and throughout the next year, be able to provide resources and skill development for our membership.
So we do have a question from Jordan West, who is asking, could you share more with attendees about how racial justice and decolonization is centered and not dismissive of other social identities that we each hold? I think Stephen touched on this, and to expand may be helpful.
So I think from my perspective to that question, so the ways in which I think racial justice and decolonization are centered is that, I mean, each of us has a race in some way. So, you know, from my understanding for Native peoples, it's not race in the same way that I define my racial identity as a Black person. But our existence as race beings means that we're connected to a history of colonization, connected to a history of being oppressed, of not having the power to sometimes define who we are in the ways in which we want to define them. And so to me, I think that's how I see the centering of race, is that we have to think about the ways in which race informs our day-to-day practices, and the ways in which we may not think about our race because of the privilege that we hold, for example, as white people with a racial identity. That doesn't mean, however, that my other identities don't also matter in this case. And so I can center race, or I can center racial justice or decolonization, and also know that I exist at the intersection of these other identities that I hold. So my gender still matters, my sexual orientation still matters, because they're all tied again to systems of privilege, power, and oppression. And so to me, I think that's where it is. So race might be salient for me in this present moment, but it doesn't mean that my other identities don't exist alongside it. So it's not like you add on my sexual orientation, you add on my gender, but they all come with me together. And I think that's what thinking of our identities in a more intersected way calls us to do, is to think about the holism of them, and then how they're attached to systems of privilege and power. So I think that is maybe where I would start, and then I don't know if you have things to add, Craig, but that's what I would say as an initial place.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think I would add, from a systems level, I think that our country, our society, um, still struggles very deeply with racial inequity. So I think very much this is a starting place, but it's an important starting place given our history of racism on multiple fronts. And you see it all around us still currently. Like, this is not just a historical issue for us, like it is current now. It's centered in the immigration and the detention of families. Currently, it's with Mexican American, Chicano, Latino families. It is also centered in the ongoing murder and killing of African Americans. It is centered in lots of almost any of our current um, social issues can be in some ways connected to racial injustice and decolonization. So that's current as well as the historical. And so until we can reconcile that, I don't think we can effectively move um, into reconciling with the other places of oppression, including gender and orientation and class. Um, so,
Thank you
and I
both.
think,
Oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
We just have another question from Kristen Calente Skendal. She says, Craig, can you talk about how the strategic imperative will be part of your presidential platform moving into 2020?
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Yes. So Jamie and Stephen and I have spent a lot of time talking about how do we continue the imperative into its next logical iterations. So Jamie and the convention team are working right now um, to really create the concrete um, essence of the imperative through the convention and through the programming through the year. And so it's hard for me to necessarily, without Jamie here, to really talk about the details of that because he knows them more intimately than I. But I think that, until we have those concrete things, it's hard for me to build forward on that. But the kinds of things that I've been thinking anyway have been building upon where Stephen and I started about how do we develop knowledge and skills in our association and our membership, and so that we can then have very effective action toward creating social justice um, within our association and on our campuses. And so for me, that's what I think we'll need. And I connect that to my own development as an individual, as a white person, as a man, as a practitioner, and it's a lot of, in some ways, trying to find understanding and to find community around this has been an important first step about it, but recognizing that not stopping there is really important. And for me, so Howard Zinn, I think, is an important influencer in that. And when he wrote his autobiography, he titled it "You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train." And for me, this idea that us just having awareness and consciousness about all these things isn't going to stop this train from moving forward. And so we have to be active and strategic in our skills, navigating individual circumstances, but also strategic in our action to be able to move this train onto another track. And so I want us to really be able to give each other ways of being, so that we know how to be with each other in a racially just and a decolonized relationship. But then we can then be collective work collectively work to be able to shift systems of oppression and create communities centered around justice. So that's kind of where I'm thinking. I think some of that is, what speakers do we have? What kind of programming do we have? All of those details I'm not quite sure yet, but it's really important to me to be able to continue the work. I think especially being the first white president after 3 black presidents, I think is a really important. It's really important for me to continue to be visible and public with work of the association around the strategic imperative, because of I'll say this from my own thing. I don't know that I had very many role models for what it meant to be a just white person. And so I want to be able to help us become the role models for the next generation. And so that we can really effectively do this work.
Thanks, Greg. Another question that came through from Spencer Scruggs. Since the association generally represents a profession, in what ways will the association lead the conversation and center social justice and decolonization beyond just our membership and at the association level? Seems as though he's wanting to know how it will become more generally adopted in student affairs, or what we're going to do to make that happen.
Stephen, you want to tackle that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a tough question because my sense is it feels sort of presumptuous of me to believe that we as an association are solely responsible for ensuring that racial justice and decolonization is infused throughout all of student affairs generally beyond our membership. And so I think, to me, maybe this is so sorry, Spencer, but maybe this is a cop-out answer. But I think I'm generally less invested in trying to figure out how it makes sense for the rest of the profession. And I'm way more invested in trying to figure out how it makes sense for me first and foremost, because I think that's the most important piece. And then how it makes sense for those who are within my circles of influence, my colleagues, my friends, people on the governing board who I have more day-to-day work with. Because I think if we figure it out amongst ourselves first, and then I think that the other pieces will not necessarily work themselves out, but it becomes, I think, it becomes easier, I think, then, because we're invested in figuring out what this means for us first and foremost, because we all have work to do amongst ourselves. And so I think that, to me, is like where I'm interested in is thinking about my spheres of influence. So I teach master students and doc students. So every week for fall and spring semesters, I have 15 to 20 students in my class. Like, what am I doing in that space to talk about racial justice and decolonization with them? Every month I have a governing board meeting. What am I doing in that space to talk with my colleagues on the board about that? And then when I'm at convention, who are the people there that I engage with? When I'm at the other professional development institutes that ACPA has, how am I talking about racial justice and decolonization in those spaces? So I think, to me, that's where the work happens. And then maybe beyond that, it starts to filter into other pieces outside of our membership. But I would start with those places first.
Okay, we have another question from Shanice Brittany Clark. The student learning imperative, another imperative in our functional area, provided a foundation for making sense of our work. What are thoughts on publishing anything similar to that document or future steps in growing the imperative?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. And I'm glad for it because it actually came up at our summer leadership meeting last month, where this very point of, it seems like what folks might need is something akin to the student learning imperative or the student personnel point of view, some sort of guiding document that outlines the imperative that folks can use, can think about, can react to, can critique, etc. And so, I mean, yeah. So I feel like we have talked about that, and I really love the idea, and so I do think it's something that hopefully will be forthcoming. I just don't have a sense of like when and how. But I think yes, you're right on with that question, and so I'm excited about that question. Excited about something like this that I think helps move the association around this imperative forward in a way that I think can be helpful for our members. So yes to all of that.
Yeah.
So I did want to chime in quickly and just apologize on behalf of Jamie, our president. He's unable to join us and certainly sends his apologies that something came up, but we will do our best to get him on another Facebook Live event in the near future because I think he does have some really imperative things to say about the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. So we will certainly try to get his voice out there as well in the near future, but please continue to add in any comments or questions, and we will continue with that until there are none left. So we do have another one from Margaret Sebastian. She says, hey, Stephen and Craig, what programs will the association use to highlight the imperative in the future? So that sounds like a resource question.
I feel like the star of the show has failed to show up, and that Stephen and I have to carry this. So I think, it's an interesting thing about the programming. I think in some ways we will have some very specific, intentional conversation points throughout the year. But I think more importantly, that we are interweaving the strategic imperative with the work that we're continuing to doing. I mean, I think this is we're trying to not repeat the patterns that we see on our campuses where we tend to do this kind of one-off work rather than how do we infuse this within our curriculum, within our professional development curriculum. Racial justice and decolonization shows up in every aspect of the work we do, both within the association and on our campuses. And so our work is evolving the curriculum so that it continues to be relevant in future thinking. And maybe this is that question is also the connection to the previous one about how are we are in the process of inspiring the next generation and creating the curriculum as we are doing it, and so.
Great, thank you. Jasmine Lee asks if you can talk about how you expect ACPA entity group leaders to help lead this work, specifically those leading groups not already centered around racialized or politicized identities. And just for everyone watching, an ACPA entity group are our involvement groups within the association, so our communities of practice, coalitions, commissions, chapters, and international divisions.
You want to start, Craig, and then I can chime in?
You got it. Yeah, I think so. All of us need to be leading this work and figuring out where our entry point is. So I think our assembly and our entity groups, for spending some time, that leadership group spending some time discussing where this shows up in the work that they're doing, I think is important for us to find connection points. But I think, so at that group level, I think that's important. But I also think individually, like each of us, all 5,000 members, I hope are spending some time in dialogue with themselves and with their colleagues and the people that they trust to be in conversation about what does this mean for the work that I do on our campus? How do we shift? How can I practice our profession and the work we do with students in a more racially just and decolonized way? And if there are resources that I need or obstacles to that, what do I need to be able to do that? And be taking a systematic approach to to the work. So I think all of us have a part in that. Certainly. So I guess this would be my answer to that question. I think it's a really great question, but my answer to that question really is expanding the notion of leadership. That all of us have the opportunity to be leaders in this conversation and being able to provide resources and to address it when it comes up in the moment, and to be able to really wrestle with these really complex ideas. So I think there's a great opportunity for all of us to show up in lots of ways.
So the piece that I would add is, so at our summer leadership meeting last month, one of the comments that came up was somebody said something that they're going to do is, for maybe the first hour of their monthly meetings, they will spend time on the usual tasks that they have to do on the agenda of the meeting, and then spend the second half on specifically talking about the imperative. So what does this mean for our work as an entity group? And so to me, I really resonated with that idea, because it doesn't necessarily mean that one has to. Yeah, I think we're quick to go towards like programs, like we have to do programs around this, and I think that is helpful. And I also think it's important to just think about, what does this mean for the daily conversations that we have. So how are we showing up differently in our meeting spaces? Like, how are we providing room for talking about this with people who we need to talk about it with? And so, like, for example, for me, it's important for me as a cisgender man to talk with other cisgender men about sexism and patriarchy. So how am I making space in my circles to do that? It's important for white folks to talk with other white people about race and racism and whiteness. So how are you making space in your circles for that to happen? And so to me, I think that's the ways in which I see the entity groups coming in to shift their work around the imperative, is investing time in what you do already and providing space and connections to this imperative in a way that you might not have previously. So to me, I think that's one sort of way in which to put it into practice, so to speak, and make it more central in the work that we are doing.
Right. And I think, Stephen, you talked about the caucusing, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to continue the caucus work, not just at convention, but how are we continuing to gather in our caucus spaces to be in dialogue with what this means for us. We can read books, watch movies, read articles to prompt dialogue and conversation, but I think it's that ongoing engagement that all of us can do that will continue to make a difference.
Great, thank you. Stephanie Bent would like to know if you can clarify the scope of this initiative. So is this looking at decolonization within the U.S. context, or is this being discussed for international contexts where ACPA has members, chapters as well?
Great question. At least, so there's no question that racial justice and decolonization, the work of that, there's no question that it's a global issue and concern. And I think for me, it's going back until we can reconcile what that means for us in the United States. It's hard for us to really grapple with how that shifts at a global dimension. And again, that's a whole nother layer of interconnection about that. So my answer to that is that's certainly work that we need to do, and I think we have opportunities through our connection with other associations and our international members to talk about how that looks and how that feels and how that is connected, and it's very much a starting point for us to reconcile with what that means domestically.
Great. Jesse Grant asks, what is the expectation of ACPA members with the initiatives? how can we begin to have these discussions on our campuses?
I mean, I think for me, the expectation is I'll go back to something I said previously. The expectation for me is that we just begin to have dialogues about it. So what are the spaces in which we start to talk about racial justice and decolonization? If we are unfamiliar with the term decolonization, what are the resources we can gather to educate ourselves so that we can be more informed to have the conversations about it? So, you know, when I served as president, I was blown away when I got the feedback about that racial justice doesn't necessarily capture the experiences of our Native folks. And it took me some time to find my bearings and to get out of the place of resistance and defensiveness that I was in, to read and talk with folks to help me understand more about it. And so to me, I think it's a humbling experience, but there's always something that we don't know. And so the reality is, like, part of that is if we aren't unsure, what are the resources that we can find to help us understand better? And then are there people within our circles of influence, within our spheres, that we can talk to, that we can help, that we can learn more about this topic? So to me, I think one big expectation is that we just start having conversations with people that we connect with, and then extending it from there and inviting people into those conversations that we might normally not connect with as well. And that to me is an important initial step in the process. And that's what I'm hoping from our members, is that they just start having the conversation and also just educating themselves.
Yeah, I would agree. I think just start. And I think, you know, we've got really strong, there's a lot of strong state associations within ACPA. And so how can we have our conversations also regionally or kind of locally? So can we partner with other institutions around us to be able to have some professional development conversations? But I also think, too, about how do we, I guess, to encourage each of us to be courageous and to be imperfect. And I think the idea of perfection, or that I have to be well-versed in this to start, holds us back. And in so many ways, that's so much about whiteness anyway. But I think just be imperfect and be and ask and invite. And I think people are willing to join and be a part of that that conversation and struggle when it's from an invitation centered in community and the willingness to be vulnerable.
Yeah, I appreciate that point, Craig. This notion of needing to be perfect or have it right before engaging, I think holds so many of us back from so many things in life. And so, and the reality is, like, I don't want to minimize, it's so hard because it's a classic case of, like, both and. Like, I don't want to minimize the harm that can come when we engage issues, when we have no idea about what we're talking about. And at the same time, if we wait too long to have it all figured out, that can also cause harm as well. And so it's this classic case of, like, we're so afraid, I think, of messing up or getting it right that it holds us back in so many ways. And I see how that has impacted my own life as well. And so to me, I think that's critical, is that we have to just engage and let go of that fear. And I know that fear is very real. And then the last piece that I'll say on this point too is that, where did my point go? Right there. Oh, there it is. I found it. Okay, so the last thing that I'll say is that, like, let me take myself as an example. So as a Black person, I frequently ask my white friends and colleagues to engage issues of race. Like, that is something that I expect them to do and that I want them to do. So the reality is, if a white person then chooses to engage the topic of race, I can't then, like, come after them and say, you didn't do this right, or you're messing it all up, or hey, I didn't mean in that way. So it's this tension of like, yes, like if we're asking folks with dominant identities to engage, then we also have to have patience in the process of them engaging. And that doesn't mean that it removes the onus from them of causing harm, of being responsible. But I just think that we have to allow people, we have to give people space to engage if we're asking that from them. And because that's the process of like learning. So as an educator, in the classroom, I'm invested in the process of my students learning. And so because of that, I have to give them space to learn in their own ways. And it may not be in the way that I want that to happen. It may not be as quick as I want it to happen. But if I'm in the business of learning and educating, then that means creating space for people to do that in the ways that they need to do that, while also knowing that in the process of learning and educating, harm is always it always happens. Like we can't not harm people in this work. And so I think that fear is real. It prevents us from moving forward. And if we're asking folks to engage, then we have to give them space to do that. And so I think that's another thing that I think can be tricky. And I don't know, I don't have it figured out either, because I think it's hard work. And at the same time, I'm learning, when I think about my own dominant identities, how afraid I am to engage in those identities. So it gives me more empathy for white folks who I'm wanting to engage around issues of race, for example. And it helps me also have more grace for myself as I struggle to engage around the issue of decolonization. Like, to not be so hard on myself as well, to give myself some grace and patience, and to also know the places in which I caused harm and own that, but still keep moving forward in the process.
Craig must have automatic lights.
It's killing me.
So a
It's just
final
new.
question I'm seeing is from Corey Bazemore James. What are ways that you think we might work to decolonize our work as we work in colonized systems? And or how do you envision learning what decolonization means for ACPA?
Hmm. Um, Thank you, Stephen, for letting me go first. I appreciate that opportunity.
You're welcome.
I think it's a great question. Gosh, I don't even know. And I think my vision for that, I guess I'll start. I guess I'll answer that with my vision for what this means. I think we need to, um, higher education needs to change. Um, and I mean, our society needs to change. I mean, so there's lots of that. But I envision um, this system where, I go back to Adams and Bell's definition of where that people can see themselves in the work that they do. They're physically and psychologically safe. That they have the experiences that they need to help them thrive. And so I envision that higher education system and experience on our campuses where the students and the professionals that come to work can feel whole and feel like they can contribute in the way that they are meant to, and that collectively we create learning on our campuses that help people be really just citizens, to help our country then become the kind of place that I hope that it'll be. So I think in the way that I contribute to my vision, part of my question to myself every day is, what am I doing to advance that, to move that forward? And so it's how I relate to my kids. It's how I relate to my wife. It's how I schedule meetings. It's how I engage staff. It's how I supervise. It's how I work with the president. It's kind of programs that I put on. So I think for me, it's a shift, being able to shift from doing to being. And the more, so maybe this is my really cosmic answer to that, but the more that we can shift from doing the work of the strategic imperative to being the work of the strategic imperative, I think that we will get to that point. We will be creating the communities that allow justice to thrive.
I mean, I think your question, Corey, is the very crux, I think, of the tension that we exist in, is that we've all been socialized to exist within systems of colonization. And so I don't even think we know what it means to exist outside of those systems. And so short of overhauling and flipping the table on the entire system, what we're trying to do, I think, is like tricky work. Like we're trying to decolonize ourselves in a very colonized society and everything. And so some of it might feel piecemeal, like we maybe change up the ways in which we show up in a meeting space. We think of meetings very differently. Maybe it means we think of the hierarchical practices in our work very differently. So it feels like it's a piecemeal thing here and there. And the reality is, like, do piecemeal things ultimately change entire systems? Maybe, maybe not. And I think that's the hard things. But I feel like what we have now are very piecemeal things to exist with. And so for me, it means like thinking about, again, I use this term like spheres of influence a lot, because that's what gives me, I think, hope to know that to keep moving on a day-to-day basis, is I'm invested in the people who are closest to me, the people who I interact with on a daily basis, and then myself as well. So, because I think that feels more tangible to me than these larger pieces. Right. So I think that's like one thing that I would say. And then probably the last thing is I always too think about like this issue of like power. So what power or dominance do I have over people on a daily basis that I'm not even aware of? And so where are the places that I'm showing up in my dominant identities? Where are the places in which I'm showing up in ways that I exist to have power over people? And if I think of the places in which I have power over people and I try to flatten those power lines, I think that's another way in which to try to get at this notion of decolonization, is to try to resist the dominance that I have just by existing in my skin, again, as a cisgender Black man. That inherently means I have dominance over people. And so how do I think about that in my day-to-day relationships with people in a way that I don't inherently believe that I have power over people? And that's a hard thing to do when you've been socialized your whole life to believe that. And so it means a lot of unlearning. So to me, so much of this racial justice and decolonization work is unlearning a lot of the messages that we've been ingrained in. So it's not just like educating myself on racial justice and decolonization, but it's also unlearning some of the things that I've learned about myself. And to me, I think that's the ways in which we can start to do some of this work.
Yeah. You remind me, Stephen, too, that I think it's also, I think, changing the time horizon for when we think that we should be able to see the impact of this work. I think this work is generational. And so we won't, I mean, we go back to what King suggested for us. Like we aren't likely to see the impact of our work, but it's going to make a difference for our kids and our kids' kids. And then, and so if I think about it that way, then I can have faith, that I can trust that the difference that I'm making now is going to mean something. It's that ripple of change. That it's going to connect with other ripples, and then over that, there's going to be this groundswell. I think fortunately, there's so much work for us to do on a daily basis, and so doing the best we can with where we are, what our spheres are, as you talk about, but just trusting that makes a difference. and that carries me forward.
Well, thank you both so much. I haven't seen any questions for a little bit, so I think that's a good stopping point. I just wanted to end with sharing some of our upcoming events in which the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization will be centered. So hopefully it is a new fiscal year for most of you, which means if you haven't registered for ACPA 19 in Boston, it would be a great time to do so. We have a special advanced registration rate continuing through July 13. So if you would like the lowest rate that will ever be available for our Boston convention, be sure to register before that date. A lot of this great work will be centered in Boston, and the Boston team is really ensuring that it's in the forefront, and a lot of our educational programming and caucusing will be in the front. So along with that, we have the Institute for Aspiring SSAOs coming up in October, the end of October of this year, which has a theme of exploring underrepresented identities and career paths. So the faculty of the Institute will focus on how our diverse backgrounds and identities will impact a move and experience within an SSAO role. So if you're interested in at some point in the future becoming a senior student affairs officer, this would be a great event for you to check out. It's happening in Chicago, again at the end of October of this year. We have lots of other ACPA events that are still taking place in 2018. So feel free to visit myacpa.org/events to check out all of the things that are coming up. And I just wanted to thank Stephen and Craig for their time today. And this video it was recorded and will be available on our Facebook page here continuing on. So feel free to watch again or share with any sort of groups or pages that you think could benefit from the information. And we will be in touch shortly about a time in which Jamie can come on live and give his perspectives as well. So thank you so much for your time and for watching, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Bethany.
Yep.